He never let anyone into his barn his whole life. After his death, his relatives decided to open the doors, and what they found there shocked everyone. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The town was small enough that everyone knew one another's names, and yet large enough that stories about its inhabitants carried a strange mixture of truth and invention. Among all of them, none provoked more whispered curiosity than Malcolm Harrison. He had worked the same patch of earth on the southern edge of the county for more than half a century. A dark-skinned man of steady hands and quiet habits who seemed, at least to the casual observer, entirely defined by the soil beneath his boots and the cattle that grazed behind his weathered fences. But there was something about Malcolm that unsettled people, something that never quite matched the simple picture of an aging farmer. He was known for his courtesy, his willingness to lend tools or advice, his fierce independence. He paid his debts promptly, drove into town only when necessary, and never caused trouble. Yet, he carried himself with a reserve that discouraged intimacy. Neighbors who dropped by were welcomed on the porch, offered sweet tea in the summer and coffee in the winter, but were never invited beyond the threshold of his house. More than that, they noticed the way he would grow tense whenever anyone's eyes strayed toward the structure that stood at the back of his land, the barn. It was not unusual for a farmer to own a barn, but Malcolm's barn inspired speculation in a way no other outbuilding in the county ever had. It was older than most of the houses in town, its heavy beams darkened by time, its broad roof patched and repatched until the shingles looked like a quilt of mismatched colors. Yet, despite its age, the barn had been kept with meticulous care. Its doors were reinforced with steel braces. Enormous padlocks, heavy enough to secure a bank vault, fastened the handles together. Cameras, mounted on each corner of the building, blinked silently through rain and snow, their red eyes glowing in the night. Few in town had ever seen such precautions on a farm building, and fewer still could make sense of them. Children told stories about it at night. Some swore that the barn housed ghosts, restless spirits who played music at midnight that only the bravest dared to hear. Others claimed that Malcolm was hiding treasure, perhaps the spoils of some long-forgotten crime, and that anyone who entered would never return. Adults, though they laughed at the tales, carried their own theories. Some thought he must have been stockpiling weapons, preparing for a catastrophe only he foresaw. Others guessed at hidden wealth, gold bars left from the war, or a stash of illicit liquor from Prohibition days. The truth was that no one knew, because Malcolm never permitted a soul inside. He alone held the keys, and he alone walked the gravel path to those iron-clad doors, always in the dim light of evening, when shadows blurred the outline of his shoulders. Malcolm's secrecy became part of the town's fabric. He was respected, even admired for his work ethic, yet never quite trusted. He had no children of his own, no wife to soften his edges. Family existed somewhere far off, nieces and nephews in the city who rarely visited, if they visited at all. When he came into the diner for breakfast once a month, he ate in silence, eyes fixed on the plate before him. The waitress always brought him black coffee and bacon without asking. She had learned long ago that he disliked questions. When neighbors invited him to church suppers, he sometimes attended, sitting politely in the back, saying little. But whenever conversation drifted toward his farm, his jaw tightened and his gaze grew distant. He would excuse himself before anyone dared to press further. The barn stood as a kind of monument to his distance. In the summer, Sunlight caught the rusted hinges, and children riding their bikes slowed just enough to imagine shapes moving behind the cracks of the old boards. In the winter, snow drifted high against the door, but still Malcolm would shovel a path each morning, brushing away ice to check the locks. He seemed less the owner of the barn than its guardian, as if some silent vow bound him to its defense. On nights when the wind rose and the trees bent under the force of the storm, neighbors swore they saw him out there, lantern in hand, patrolling the perimeter with the determination of a soldier. It was not that Malcolm was unfriendly. Those who worked alongside him during harvest or branding season spoke of his generosity, how he would share equipment or lend a strong back when others faltered. But his kindness never breached the boundary of that barn. He accepted help with fields, he discussed cattle prices, he even laughed occasionally at a joke, though the sound was rare and startling. Yet the moment conversation drifted toward the locked building at the back of his land, his eyes cooled. More than once, a curious neighbor who suggested they step inside for a look found himself staring at a wall of silence so solid it needed no words. Over time, people grew used to the mystery. They folded it into their understanding of Malcolm, the way one accepts a scar on an old tree. The barn was locked, and that was that. He was a good man, a hard worker, but some doors were not meant to be opened. Still, late at night, as headlights swept past on the road and cast fleeting glances at the Harrison farm, whispers returned. Couples driving home from dances wondered what secrets could justify such vigilance. Children, unable to sleep, imagined music drifting across the fields. And the oldest residents shook their heads, convinced that whatever Malcolm kept behind those doors was a story best left to him. Malcolm himself offered no answers. He continued his rituals, the quiet maintenance of locks and lights, the patient tending of land and livestock. He aged visibly, his hair turning silver, his shoulders stooping, but his watchfulness never diminished. In fact, some thought it grew more intense as the years passed, as if time only deepened his bond to whatever he protected. There were nights when the glow of a single lamp shone through the cracks of the barn's siding, casting slivers of gold across the fields. Anyone who happened to see it swore they heard faint notes carried on the wind, low, mournful tones that vanished the moment they strained to listen. No one ever proved such things. No one dared approach too closely. The locks held, the cameras watched, and Malcolm endured. He was, in every way, the barn's shadow, its keeper, its secret companion. Whatever lay inside, he seemed willing to carry the burden alone, refusing companionship, refusing explanation. And so the barn became both legend and boundary, a place that defined him even as it separated him from the rest of the town. As the seasons cycled, planting, harvest, snow, and renewal, people grew older. Children left for the city. Neighbors passed away. Yet Malcolm remained, walking the same narrow path from house to barn to field, field back to the house, a figure cut in silhouette against the horizon. It was almost as though he intended to outlast them all, as though his purpose was tied not to his own life, but to the life of the secret behind those ironclad doors. No one could have predicted how the story would shift or what would finally come of the guarded barn. For the moment, Malcolm's secret remained his own, sealed away with locks and silence, while the community watched and wondered. They might never have known the truth had time not made its inevitable claim, setting into motion the events that would change everything, not only for Malcolm's forgotten family, but for the town itself. The death of Malcolm Harrison arrived quietly, as if the world had conspired to preserve the same silence he had always cultivated in life. One winter morning, when frost still lingered across the fields and the crows perched on the fence lines, his nearest neighbor noticed that no smoke rose from the chimney of the old farmhouse. Hours later, the sheriff drove down the gravel road, and by evening the news had spread through town. Malcolm, the farmer who had outlived storms and droughts, who had guarded his barn with a soldier's vigilance, was gone. He had died alone, in his sleep, with the same unobtrusive dignity that had marked his years among them. The town reacted in ways both predictable and telling. At the diner, men removed their hats, shaking their heads, while women whispered across coffee cups about what would happen next. Children asked, half in fear, half in excitement, whether the barn would finally be opened. The mystery of Malcolm's life had just been transformed into the mystery of his absence, and curiosity burned hotter than grief. The funeral was modest, held in the small church with peeling white paint at the edge of town. The congregation was larger than anyone expected. Farmers came in their work clothes, hands still stained with soil, women in plain dresses and shawls, all united by a strange mix of respect and fascination. They sat in the wooden pews, listening as the minister spoke of a man of labor, of discipline, of solitude. His words skimmed politely over the truth that Malcolm had been a mystery even to those who thought they knew him. When the hymns had been sung and the final prayer offered, the people filed out slowly as though reluctant to return to their lives until some piece of the riddle was solved. At the graveside, the cold wind stirred through the cedars, scattering dry leaves across the mound of earth. A few lingered afterward, glancing toward the distant outline of the barn, wondering if the key to understanding him lay locked away inside. For days afterward, the barn became the subject of every conversation. Some claimed that now, surely the sheriff would break the locks and reveal what had been hidden. Others insisted that the mystery should be respected, that whatever Malcolm had guarded should remain untouched. But all such speculation was interrupted when news came that the property had not been left to the county, nor abandoned to decay. Malcolm had written a will, and in it he had named his heirs, 2 young relatives from the city, a couple who had scarcely visited the farm in their lives. Their names were James and Lauren, and they were as startled by the inheritance as anyone else. When the letter from the lawyer reached them, they read it 3 times before believing it was real. James was a teacher in a public school, perpetually overworked and underpaid, while Lauren worked part-time at a bookstore, filling the rest of her days with dreams of gardens and open skies. They lived in a cramped apartment where the hum of traffic drowned out every quiet thought. To them, the notion of a farm was almost mythical, belonging to novels and old family stories. They had heard of Malcolm only in fragments, mentioned rarely at family gatherings, a distant uncle who lived apart from everyone else. Now, suddenly, the weight of his life's work, his land, and his possessions had been placed in their hands. Their first journey to the farm was made in a borrowed truck, a mix of excitement and unease pulling them along the highway. As the cityscape gave way to fields, their conversation turned from disbelief to speculation. They wondered what kind of man Malcolm had truly been, and why he had chosen them. Lauren admitted she felt a strange sense of responsibility, as if some unfinished story were waiting for them to write its last chapter. James, more practical, thought of debts, of repairs, of whether the land could be managed. But both of them silently wondered about the barn. When they arrived, the farm stood exactly as the townspeople had described it. The house weathered but sturdy, the fences sagging in places yet intact, the barn looming like a sentinel at the back of the fields. It was late afternoon, and the low sun cast long shadows across the gravel drive. They parked and stepped out, inhaling the smell of earth and wood, a scent unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. As they walked through the gate, neighbors began to appear, drawn as much by curiosity as by courtesy. Old men in overalls, women with aprons still dusted with flour, even children who clung shyly to their parents' hands, all came to greet the newcomers. The conversations were polite at first, filled with condolences and offers of help, but before long the subject turned, inevitably, to the barn. One man, his skin tanned like leather from decades in the sun, leaned in and whispered that Malcolm had been more protective of that building than of anything else on earth. Another spoke of hearing music drifting across the fields at night, though no one could say from where. A woman with sharp eyes declared that if she had been left the farm, the first thing she would do was tear down the doors and see what secrets lay inside. James and Lauren listened, exchanging uneasy glances. The barn, they realized, was not merely a part of the property. It was the heart of every question that surrounded their inheritance. That evening, when the neighbors had gone and the sky deepened into twilight, they walked down the narrow path toward the barn. The structure loomed larger with each step, its weathered boards catching the last light, the steel braces gleaming faintly. They saw the locks, heavy and old but still unyielding, and the cameras, their lenses staring blankly into the dusk. The air around the barn felt heavier than the rest of the farm, as if silence itself pooled there. They stopped a few feet away, unwilling to go closer without reason. Lauren shivered, though the air was mild, and James felt a knot of tension in his chest. Back inside the house, they unpacked their small bags and explored the rooms. Malcolm's presence lingered in every corner. The neatly stacked books, the carefully folded blankets, the tools lined in perfect order. In the top drawer of a desk, beneath envelopes and yellowed receipts, they found a sealed packet with their names written in a steady, careful hand. Inside was the official will, but also a single key attached to a brass tag engraved with one word: barn. They stared at it for a long time, neither speaking, both aware that this was not just a key to a building, but to whatever truth Malcolm had guarded for all those years. Sleep came slowly that night. From their bedroom window, they could see the silhouette of the barn against the starlit sky, silent and immovable. Every creak of the house, every sigh of wind, seemed to carry a question. What lies within? James turned the key over in his hand, the metal cool and heavy, while Lauren whispered that perhaps they were not yet ready. They both knew, however, that the moment would come. The inheritance was not only land and timber, not only cattle and soil. It was also the burden of a secret that had outlived its keeper. In the days that followed, they began to settle into the rhythms of the farm. They learned how the fields stretched beyond sight, how the light shifted across the hills, how the mornings came with a stillness so profound it almost hurt. Yet no matter what they did, their eyes always returned to the barn. It waited, silent, patient, as if knowing that its time was near. And though James and Lauren tried to postpone it, to convince themselves they could simply carry on, they both felt the same inevitability pressing down on them. The key rested in the drawer by their bed, a constant reminder that sooner or later the doors would open. And so the inheritance that had begun as an unexpected gift now carried with it a responsibility neither had anticipated. They had come to the farm to claim land, perhaps a livelihood, but what they had truly received was a riddle. The answer lay only a few steps away, behind steel locks and weathered wood, in the building that had defined Malcolm Harrison's life. The barn, the town's whispered obsession, now belonged to them, and with it the weight of whatever truth it concealed. The days after the funeral seemed to move with an unfamiliar slowness, as if time itself had been altered by their change of surroundings. James and Lauren found themselves caught between the routines of farm life and the constant awareness that they were living in the shadow of something larger, something unresolved. The key to the barn lay hidden in the drawer of their bedside table, heavy enough in their thoughts to disturb their sleep. At night, the wind moved through the fields with a low, haunting sound, and more than once Lauren woke to find James standing at the window, staring at the silhouette of the barn against the horizon. Neither spoke of it directly, but both knew that the moment of confrontation was coming closer. The neighbors continued to drop by, sometimes bringing pies or jars of preserves, sometimes offering advice about the land. Every conversation eventually circled back to the barn, though always with a kind of careful hesitation, as if the subject itself carried a taboo. One elderly man spoke of seeing Malcolm carrying crates there late at night, his lantern swinging through the darkness like a restless star. Another swore that he had once heard faint music, the sound of horns and drums drifting across the fields. These stories, vague and contradictory, only deepened the couple's unease. They thanked the neighbors politely, but felt increasingly alienated from them, as though the entire town was waiting for James and Lauren to fulfill some unspoken duty. At last, on a clear morning, when the sun broke through the clouds with unusual brightness, James announced that it was time. He said it without drama, almost casually, as if speaking the decision aloud might make it less momentous. Lauren felt her stomach tighten, yet she nodded, knowing there was no avoiding it. Together they walked down the path, the gravel crunching beneath their boots, the barn growing larger with each step. The air seemed heavier here, as though saturated with years of secrets, and the silence was so complete that even the sound of their breathing felt intrusive. The doors loomed before them, massive and unyielding. Rust streaked the steel braces, and the padlocks, though old, were thick and formidable. The cameras, their lenses coated with dust, gave the eerie impression of still watching, as if Malcolm's vigilance had outlived him. James withdrew the key from his pocket and held it for a long moment in his palm. Its brass tag caught the sunlight, the engraved word barn gleaming faintly. He felt as though he were holding not just a key, but a judgment, a summons to uncover what had been hidden. Lauren stood beside him, her hand brushing his arm for courage, her eyes fixed on the dark seam between the doors. When the key slid into the lock, the mechanism resisted at first, groaning with the protest of years. James turned harder, the metal biting into his palm, until at last there came a heavy click. The sound echoed across the yard, startling a flock of crows from the trees. The padlock dropped into his hand, unexpectedly light now that its weight of secrecy had been undone. Together they pulled at the doors. The hinges, stiff with rust, shrieked like something alive, and slowly the barn opened its mouth to them. Inside, the air was thick with dust, carrying the scent of old wood, oil, and something faintly metallic. Shafts of light broke through cracks in the siding, illuminating the interior in long, golden lines. At first glance, the space seemed unremarkable. An ordinary barn, filled with covered shapes and forgotten tools. Wooden beams stretched overhead, cobwebs clinging to the corners, and the floor was scattered with straw and dirt. Yet there was a stillness here that felt unnatural, as if the barn had been holding its breath for decades, waiting for this intrusion. They stepped cautiously across the threshold, their footsteps muffled. The silence pressed down on them, heavy and absolute. Lauren's eyes adjusted to the dimness, and she saw that beneath the dust-covered tarps stood large, mysterious forms, their outlines unfamiliar. Some looked like crates, others like pieces of furniture, but there was something deliberate about the way they had been arranged, as though Malcolm had placed each one with care. James reached out and touched the nearest tarp. The fabric was coarse and brittle, sending a puff of dust into the air. His fingers trembled slightly as he took hold and pulled it back. Beneath lay a large wooden chest, its brass fittings tarnished, its lid secured with a smaller lock that had long since rusted shut. Lauren bent to examine it, her pulse quickening. Around them, more tarps covered shapes that now seemed less like tools and more like something else entirely. Objects too carefully hidden to be ordinary. They moved deeper into the barn, drawn by a mix of fear and anticipation. Every step stirred memories of Malcolm, the image of him walking alone to these doors night after night, guarding these secrets with relentless devotion. At the far end of the barn, in the shadows where the light barely reached, they saw the largest of the covered forms. It towered above the rest, its outline angular and strange. Without speaking, they approached it. James took hold of the tarp and, after a long breath, pulled. The fabric slid away with a harsh whisper, and both of them gasped at what it revealed. It was not farming equipment or furniture, but something altogether unexpected. A shape that hinted at a life they had never known Malcolm to live. For a moment, they stood frozen, staring, unable to process the enormity of the discovery. The barn, so long the subject of rumor and speculation, was no longer just a building. It was a vault, a chamber of hidden truths, and the first glimpse of its contents had already begun to unravel everything they thought they knew. James felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck, while Lauren's hand tightened around his arm. The silence seemed to deepen, as if the barn itself acknowledged the gravity of the moment. They had stepped into a story larger than themselves, one that Malcolm had written in secret and sealed behind locks and shadows. The dust swirled in the shafts of sunlight, glowing like motes of gold, and the air grew heavier with meaning. James and Lauren exchanged a look, both knowing that what they had uncovered was only the beginning. The barn had guarded its mystery faithfully for decades, but now, with the doors open and the first tarp cast aside, the past was stirring to life. They were no longer mere heirs to a farm. They were inheritors of a secret, one that demanded to be faced. And as they stood there, surrounded by covered shapes and the lingering presence of the man who had kept them hidden, they understood that this was the first confrontation, the threshold between ignorance and revelation. Whatever came next would change not only their understanding of Malcolm Harrison, but also their place in the story he had left behind. For a long moment, James and Lauren could only stand in silence, staring at the immense object they had uncovered. The tarp had fallen away in a cloud of dust, drifting through the shafts of sunlight like smoke, and as it settled, the true shape revealed itself. What they had uncovered was not a machine for farming, not equipment meant for tilling or harvesting, but a gleaming silhouette that looked as though it had been plucked from another world entirely. Its brass fittings caught the dim light, its wooden body polished to a sheen despite the years, and the curved edges spoke of craftsmanship far beyond anything that belonged in a farmer's barn. James reached out, almost without realizing, and brushed his hand against the smooth surface. Beneath his fingers was not just wood, but history, preserved with a reverence that made his breath catch in his throat. They moved together through the barn, pulling back more covers, opening more corners of Malcolm's secret life. Each reveal brought with it a shock that deepened the mystery and reshaped their image of the man they thought they had inherited from. There were instruments, more than they could count at first. Saxophones with bells that glimmered faintly beneath the dust. Trumpets with delicate valves that still shone despite the passing of years. A double bass resting proudly on its stand, its varnish deep and rich like a captured sunset. There were drums, too, their skins carefully preserved, and clarinets lined neatly in their cases. Every instrument looked ready to be played, as though time itself had been held at bay inside this barn. Lauren's eyes grew wide as she realized the magnitude of what they were seeing. She had always loved music, had collected old records when they could afford them, but nothing had prepared her for this. These were not random instruments gathered without thought. They were a collection, a museum of sound hidden behind locked doors. She moved closer to one of the saxophones and saw, inscribed on the brass, a name she recognized from history, a maker whose instruments had been prized by jazz legends of the 20th century. Her hands trembled as she whispered it aloud, her voice breaking the silence like a fragile note. James, though not as versed in musical history, felt the gravity of it nonetheless. He could see in her expression that this was no mere hobby. Beyond the instruments were shelves of boxes, each carefully labeled in Malcolm's precise handwriting. They opened the first and discovered stacks of vinyl records, their covers vibrant with colors and fonts from eras long past. Some were cracked and worn, but many looked pristine as if they had never been played. Lauren sifted through them with reverent hands, pulling out names that echoed like legends: Armstrong, Ellington, Holiday, Parker. Each sleeve seemed a relic, a window into a time when music carried not only melody but defiance, when every note was a rebellion and every performance an act of courage. They moved to another shelf and found stacks of photographs, neatly bound in albums. The first pages revealed grainy black and white images of smoky rooms filled with musicians. Men in sharp suits bent over their horns. Women in elegant dresses sang into microphones, their faces frozen mid-song. And among them, almost hidden in the back rows, stood Malcolm. Younger, his hair darker, his eyes lit with a fire that neither of them had ever imagined in the stoic man described by neighbors. There he was, with his arm slung around other players, smiling in a way they had never seen, captured in moments of joy and belonging. Lauren pressed her fingers to the photographs, her throat tightening. It was as if the man they thought they knew had stepped out of the shadows, revealing a version of himself that he had buried beneath years of silence. The deeper they searched, the clearer the story became. Malcolm had not merely been a farmer. He had lived another life, one kept secret from the town and even from his own family. He had been a musician, part of a world that thrived in hidden corners and dimly lit clubs, a world that often refused entry to men of his color, yet could never silence their music. The barn was not a prison for secrets, but a sanctuary, a place where he had preserved the fragments of that life, keeping them safe from time and from judgment. James sat down heavily on an old stool, staring at the instruments with a mix of awe and disbelief. He tried to reconcile the image of the quiet, solitary man described by the neighbors with the vibrant figure in the photographs. It was as if two separate lives had coexisted within Malcolm, one visible and plain, the other burning brightly in the shadows. Lauren knelt beside another chest, her fingers fumbling at the latch until it gave way. Inside, she found more papers, letters written in a firm, practiced hand. She unfolded the first and began to read aloud. The letters were fragments of memory, addressed to friends, fellow musicians, perhaps even to himself. They spoke of long nights in clubs where music drowned out the pain of the world outside, of friendships forged in rhythm and melody, of the sting of rejection when audiences turned away because of the color of his skin. Yet, through the bitterness ran a current of pride, of determination to preserve the art that had defined him. He wrote of moments when the music soared above everything, when the horn in his hands felt like a voice stronger than words, capable of cutting through injustice. He wrote, too, of fear, that one day these memories would vanish, erased by time or prejudice, unless someone kept them alive. Lauren's voice trembled as she read, the words striking her like confessions whispered across decades. James listened in silence, his thoughts turning to the weight of the inheritance they now carried. The farm was not merely soil and timber, not merely livestock and fences. It was a vault for a legacy that spanned beyond the boundaries of the county, beyond even their understanding of family. The light in the barn shifted as the afternoon waned, deepening the shadows, turning the dust into glowing embers in the air. They moved slowly, uncovering more pieces of Malcolm's past. There were ticket stubs from trains and buses that had carried him to distant cities, programs from concerts long forgotten, and even handwritten sheet music, lines of notes curling across yellowed pages. Some bore his own name, scribbled in the corner, as though he had tried his hand at composition. The realization that Malcolm had not only played music but created it filled them with a strange pride, mingled with sorrow that no one had known. As the hours passed, the weight of discovery settled heavier on their shoulders. They could feel Malcolm's presence in every artifact, every photograph, every note preserved in vinyl grooves. It was as if he had been waiting for them, choosing them as the ones who would finally unseal his hidden truth. They could not shake the sense that by opening the barn, they had stepped into a role he had intended, even if he had never said it aloud. When evening fell and the first stars appeared beyond the cracks of the walls, James and Lauren finally paused. They sat together on the wooden floor, surrounded by instruments and memories, their breaths echoing in the stillness. Neither spoke for a long time. Words seemed inadequate against the immensity of what they had uncovered. The barn, once a fortress of secrecy, had become a cathedral of soundless music, every object a note in a symphony that spanned decades. At last, Lauren whispered that they could never see Malcolm the same way again. James nodded, his eyes fixed on a photograph of the young man who had once stood proudly with his saxophone, laughter frozen in silver light. They both felt the shift inside them, the understanding that they had not merely inherited land, but had been entrusted with a legacy. The barn had revealed itself, and with it the hidden soul of the man who had guarded it so fiercely. As they rose to leave, closing the doors gently behind them, they felt the enormity of what lay ahead. The secret was no longer locked away, and with its unveiling came a responsibility. They walked back to the house hand in hand, the night air cool against their skin, the stars sharp and bright above them. Behind them the barn stood silent once more, but its silence was no longer impenetrable. It was alive with the echo of music, of laughter, of voices long gone yet preserved. The past had spoken, and they were now its keepers. In the days that followed, James and Lauren felt as though they were walking with a secret too heavy to bear. The barn, once a symbol of silence and suspicion, had opened its heart to them, and what they had found inside seemed too vast, too astonishing to remain hidden. They tried at first to keep it to themselves, to lock the doors again, and pretend nothing had changed. But such discoveries do not stay buried for long. The neighbors, already consumed with curiosity, noticed the change in their demeanor, the way their eyes flicked towards the barn with something between wonder and fear. It did not take much for whispers to grow into questions and questions into rumors. The first to intrude was Mrs. Callahan, the woman who had lived down the road all her life and had brought them a casserole the night they moved in. She stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to check on their settling in, but her eyes strayed constantly toward the path that led to the barn. Finally, with a nervous laugh, she asked if they had been inside yet. James hesitated, but before he could answer, Lauren nodded faintly. That small admission was all it took. By the time Mrs. Callahan left, her basket lighter and her heart brimming with speculation, the story had already begun its journey through the town. Within 2 days, there were knocks on their door from men in worn hats and overalls, women carrying jars of preserves, young people who leaned on the porch rail as if they were simply curious about the farm. Each found a way to ask the same question. Had they opened the barn? Had they discovered what Malcolm had hidden? James and Lauren exchanged looks, trying to fend off the tide of curiosity, but the weight of truth pressed harder with every passing hour. They could not lie, not convincingly, and soon the words slipped out. Yes, they had opened it. Yes, there was something inside. No, it was not guns or gold, not treasure in the way the town had imagined. It was something far greater. The first time they allowed a neighbor inside, it was almost by accident. Mr. Daniels, an old farmer who had been Malcolm's closest acquaintance, asked with a gravity that could not be denied. His eyes were not greedy, only filled with longing for understanding. James unlocked the doors, and together they stepped into the dusty sanctuary. When Mr. Daniels saw the instruments, the photographs, the rows of vinyl records, his lips parted in astonishment. For a long moment, he said nothing, only walked among them as though wandering through a dream. Then he removed his hat and whispered that he had always known Malcolm carried music inside him. That single moment was the crack that broke the dam. Word spread faster than wind, and soon the farm was no longer a place of quiet inheritance, but a pilgrimage site for the curious. Cars began to appear along the dirt road, some with local plates, others from neighboring towns. Reporters from the county paper arrived, their notebooks ready, their eyes bright with hunger for a story. They photographed the barn, scribbled down details, and pressed James and Lauren with questions. How had Malcolm come to possess such a collection? Why had he kept it hidden? What did it mean? James felt overwhelmed, cornered by the onslaught, while Lauren, though equally shaken, tried to answer as best she could. She spoke of the photographs, of Malcolm's youth as a musician, of the letters that revealed his longing to preserve the art he had loved. The reporters left with headlines forming in their minds, headlines that would carry Malcolm's name into homes across the state. The reaction in the community was a storm of emotions. Some were thrilled, proud to learn that one of their own had been a part of a hidden chapter of American music. They spoke of heritage, of how Malcolm had placed their town on the map, how his story should be celebrated. Others were skeptical, even resentful. They muttered that if Malcolm had really been part of something so important, he would have said so. They accused James and Lauren of exaggerating, of seeking attention, even of planting the instruments themselves to concoct a legend. The arguments spilled into diners and churches, into barbershops and grocery aisles. The barn had become a mirror reflecting every shade of envy, pride, suspicion, and wonder. Then came the experts. A professor of music history from the State University arrived with 2 graduate students, their car heavy with books and recording equipment. They moved through the barn with the reverence of pilgrims, noting every instrument, every scrap of paper, every photograph. They explained that such a collection was not only rare but priceless, a treasure of cultural history that could rival small museums. The instruments, they said, were not just tools, but artifacts, many crafted by renowned makers, some once played by legendary musicians. The records contained performances long thought lost, while the letters and photographs offered glimpses into a hidden world of segregated clubs and underground concerts. When the professor declared that the collection was worth millions, a hush fell over the barn. Even James and Lauren were stunned, though they had suspected its value. The neighbors, however, were divided more sharply than ever. For some, the revelation confirmed their pride. For others, it stoked resentment and greed. Suggestions flew like arrows. Sell it to a museum, auction it to collectors, build a monument in town. Each voice carried its own vision of what should be done, and soon the debate grew into a battle that threatened to consume the couple. James felt the weight of expectation pressing on him. He had never asked for this, had never imagined that he would be responsible for deciding the fate of something so immense. Lauren, too, felt torn between duty and fear. She walked through the barn each morning, touching the instruments as though they might whisper guidance, but the answers never came easily. They both knew that whatever choice they made would shape not only their future, but also the memory of Malcolm himself. At night, when the crowds had gone and the barn stood silent again, they sat together in the farmhouse, listening to the echoes of the day. They spoke in hushed tones about the growing attention, about the strangers who now lingered at the edge of the property, about the letters that continued to yield secrets of Malcolm's past. They felt both honored and burdened, caught between love for the legacy and the fear that it might slip from their grasp. The farm, once a quiet inheritance, had become the center of a storm, and they were its unwilling anchors. Yet, beneath the chaos, there was a current of awe that neither of them could deny. Each time they walked into the barn and saw the instruments glowing softly in the dim light, they felt Malcolm's presence, steady and strong. They understood, more clearly with each passing day, that he had not guarded this collection out of selfishness, but out of devotion. He had known its worth not only in money, but in memory, in the preservation of a truth that history might otherwise have forgotten. And now that truth was theirs to protect, even as the community clamored for its own claim. The town would never look at Malcolm the same way again. The man who had lived among them in silence had been revealed as a guardian of culture, a participant in a hidden world of music and resistance. Some were humbled, some were angry, but all were changed. And James and Lauren, standing at the center of it, realized that their lives would never return to the simplicity they once knew. The barn had given up its secrets, but the consequences of revelation were only beginning. The days after the experts had declared the collection priceless felt both unreal and unbearably heavy for James and Lauren. The farm, once a quiet inheritance that promised only hard work and long days, had become the focus of attention from every corner of the county and beyond. The barn no longer stood in solitude. It had become a destination, a point of argument, a dream of profit, and a source of pride. Strangers lingered at the gates, and neighbors whispered suggestions with an urgency that bordered on command. In every conversation, whether at the grocery store in town or across the fence line of the farm, the same question pressed forward: what will you do with it all? James tried to offer polite answers, vague promises of thought and patience, but in truth he and Lauren felt more lost than ever. The farmhouse itself seemed to carry the weight of expectation. Each room bore the mark of Malcolm's orderly habits, but now the air was thick with the voices of visitors and the scent of paper disturbed from its long rest. They had begun to sort through the documents left behind, searching for any clue to guide them, and it was during one of those long evenings that Lauren discovered the envelope. It was tucked deep in a drawer of Malcolm's old desk, hidden beneath tax receipts and farm ledgers, its paper yellowed but the handwriting still sharp and clear. Across the front, in deliberate letters, were the words, "To those who come after me." They opened it together by lamplight, their hands trembling as if they knew instinctively that these words would decide everything. Inside was a letter, written in Malcolm's steady hand, and though his voice was gone, his presence seemed to return as Lauren read it aloud. He spoke of his life not as a farmer, but as a man who had once belonged to the music. He described the nights when clubs closed their doors to him, when audiences turned away, when laws and prejudice pressed like iron against his chest. He wrote of the solace he had found in the sound of brass and strings, of the way a saxophone could carry his soul farther than words ever could. He wrote of the friends he had loved and lost, of the stages lit dimly by smoke and candles, of the crowds that sometimes cheered and sometimes jeered. He admitted the bitterness of those memories, but also the pride that survived them. Most of all, Malcolm explained why he had locked it all away. He confessed that he feared the world might forget, that history might erase the contributions of men and women who had poured their hearts into music only to be silenced by injustice. The barn, he said, was his promise to them, his way of ensuring that their voices would not vanish. He had guarded it because it was fragile, because greed or neglect might scatter it to the winds, leaving nothing but silence. And yet, he admitted, he had grown old and could guard it no longer. His last decision, he wrote, was to entrust it to his heirs, to those who came after, in the hope that they would find not only the value of the things themselves, but the meaning they carried. By the time Lauren finished, tears had welled in her eyes. James sat with his head bowed, the words echoing in the small room like a sermon. They felt as though Malcolm had spoken directly to them across the gulf of death, leaving them not only a burden but a calling. The choice that had weighed so heavily now seemed even heavier, for it was no longer about money or land. It was about honoring a life, about safeguarding a memory that stretched far beyond their own. The letter sparked long nights of discussion between them. James, practical and often pressed by the reality of bills and debts, could not help but consider the financial side. They could sell part of the collection, perhaps just a handful of instruments or records, enough to secure their future and keep the farm alive. Lauren, though she understood, recoiled at the thought of scattering what Malcolm had so carefully preserved. To break it apart would be to undo his life's work, to betray the very trust he had placed in them. Their conversations circled endlessly, rising in tension, quieting again, only to return the next evening with new doubts and fears. The town offered no peace. Some voices grew louder, urging them to sell everything and bring prosperity to the county. Others insisted that the collection should remain intact, perhaps housed in a museum or a cultural center that would draw visitors and honor Malcolm's legacy. Each suggestion came with its own sense of urgency, its own arguments for what was right. James and Lauren felt trapped between these currents, their own thoughts pulled in opposite directions. At times, James envied the simplicity of Malcolm's solitude, the silence that had protected him from the world's demands. But that silence was gone, replaced by a chorus of expectations that could not be ignored. It was Lauren who finally returned to the barn alone one night, seeking clarity. She lit a lantern and walked slowly among the instruments, the photographs, the letters. She ran her fingers along the cool brass of a trumpet, paused before a photograph of Malcolm laughing with a group of musicians, and felt the walls close in with memory. She imagined the music that must once have filled the air, the rhythms and melodies that had carried hope through hardship. And she realized then that selling it all for money would reduce it to objects, stripping away the soul that bound them together. When she returned to the farmhouse, her decision was firm. James listened as she spoke, and though doubt still tugged at him, he saw the truth in her eyes. He could not deny the force of Malcolm's words, nor the weight of the trust placed in them. Slowly, reluctantly, he yielded to the choice that now seemed inevitable. They would keep the collection together. They would honor the letter and the life it described. Money could ease their burdens, but it could never replace the meaning they had been given. The decision did not end the struggle. They still faced questions of how to protect the collection, how to share it without losing it, how to preserve Malcolm's intent while living their own lives. But the core choice was made. They would not betray him. They would not scatter his legacy to the winds. They would become the guardians he had asked for, even if the task felt impossibly large. In the days that followed, they began to turn away the offers that flooded in. Collectors who promised riches, neighbors who pressed for auctions, even museums that argued for possession. Each refusal brought its own backlash, its own murmurs of criticism. But James and Lauren held steady. They returned to the barn often, walking through the silent congregation of instruments, reminding themselves of the vow they had taken. The weight of responsibility still pressed heavily, but beneath it was a new strength, a sense of purpose they had not felt before. Malcolm's voice, preserved in ink and paper, had guided them through the storm. His letter had cut through the noise of greed and doubt, reminding them of what truly mattered. And though they knew the path ahead would be difficult, they also knew it was the only one that would honor him. The barn was no longer merely a building filled with secrets. It was a legacy, a trust, a responsibility that bound them not just to the past, but to the future. As spring unfolded across the fields, the air warming and the earth softening for planting, James and Lauren felt the farm begin to take shape around them. They were not simply heirs to land and cattle. They were heirs to a story, to a history that stretched far beyond themselves. And with that inheritance came the choice they had made, a choice that would shape the rest of their lives. The community might not understand, the voices might never quiet, but they had Malcolm's words to guide them. They had chosen to honor him, and in doing so, they had found a path that was their own. The decision they had made in the quiet of the farmhouse, guided by Malcolm's words, became the foundation for everything that followed. Though the pressure from neighbors and strangers did not disappear overnight, James and Lauren felt steadier, as though the letter had rooted them in soil deeper than any field they might plow. They understood now that the barn was not meant to remain a locked shrine, nor was it meant to be broken apart and scattered to the winds. It was meant to live again, to speak to others as it had spoken to them, to keep the voices of the past alive for those yet to come. Slowly, step by step, they began the work of transforming secrecy into legacy. At first, the idea of opening the barn to others terrified them. The collection seemed too fragile, too personal to expose to the constant touch of visitors. Yet, as they walked through it each day, dusting the instruments, straightening the photographs, arranging the records on their shelves, they began to feel the space change. It no longer felt like a vault of shadows, but a place that yearned for light. Lauren suggested that perhaps the barn itself had waited all these years for this moment, for its doors to be opened not in scandal or greed, but in reverence. James, though cautious, found himself agreeing. They began to imagine what it might become. Not a museum in the distant city, not a collection locked away in some institution, but a living place on the very soil Malcolm had loved. The transformation did not happen quickly. They started with the simplest tasks. James repaired the hinges, sanding away rust and oiling the joints until the heavy doors swung open smoothly. Lauren washed the windows high in the gables, letting in streams of daylight that turned the dust into gold. Together, they cleared the clutter, stacking broken crates and discarded tools outside, sweeping the floor until the wide planks shone with a muted glow. As they worked, they spoke softly of what it might mean to welcome others here, to allow the community that had once whispered and speculated to finally step inside and see the truth. News of their plans spread quickly, carried by neighbors and confirmed when Lauren herself spoke of it at the small church one Sunday. She explained that they would not sell the collection, nor would they hide it away again. They would open the barn carefully, thoughtfully, so that everyone could learn what Malcolm had preserved. The announcement sent ripples through the congregation. Some smiled with pride, others frowned with skepticism, but no one could deny the significance. The whispers that had once carried suspicion now turned to anticipation. When, at last, the barn opened to the public, it was a day of clear skies and warm breezes. Families gathered along the gravel road, children tugging at their parents' hands, old men leaning on canes, women in bright dresses shading their eyes against the sun. James and Lauren stood together at the doors, nervous but resolute, and when the first visitors stepped inside, they felt Malcolm's presence settle around them like a blessing. The people moved slowly, their eyes widening as they took in the instruments, the photographs, the shelves of records. Gasps and murmurs filled the air, followed by silence, the kind of silence born of reverence. For many, it was as though they were seeing Malcolm for the first time, not as the quiet farmer who had walked among them, but as the musician and guardian he had always been. The local school arranged a visit soon after, bringing children who had heard only fragments of the story. They crowded into the barn, their laughter and questions filling the space with life. Lauren showed them the photographs, pointing out Malcolm's figure among the musicians, while James played recordings from the old vinyl on a turntable they had restored. The music rose through the rafters, rich and defiant, filling the barn with the sounds it had once held in silence. The children swayed and clapped, their voices mingling with the echo of horns and drums, and in that moment the past and present seemed to meet, joined by the rhythm that had never truly died. Soon, the barn became more than a museum. It became a gathering place, a center of culture for a town that had never before imagined itself worthy of such a role. Local musicians came to play, standing where Malcolm once had, their notes carrying his legacy forward. Scholars visited, writing articles and giving lectures about the significance of the collection, about the way it preserved a forgotten chapter of American history. Even tourists arrived, traveling from distant places to see the unlikely treasure hidden in a farmer's barn. Each left with a sense of awe, each carried away a piece of the story. James and Lauren, though still burdened by the demands of the farm, found themselves invigorated by the responsibility. Their lives were no longer small, no longer bound by the quiet anonymity they had known in the city. They had become stewards of memory, guardians of a legacy larger than themselves. At night, when the barn stood dark and silent again, they would sit on the porch and listen to the wind in the trees, feeling both the exhaustion of their labor and the satisfaction of their purpose. They spoke often of Malcolm, of the way his silence had once frustrated the town, and of how that silence had given way to something greater than anyone had expected. Not all voices were silenced, of course. There were still those who grumbled that the collection should have been sold, that money was more practical than music. There were still skeptics who doubted the stories, who claimed Malcolm had merely been a collector rather than a participant in history. But those voices grew fainter with each passing month, drowned out by the sound of children laughing in the barn, by the music that played on Saturdays, by the pride that began to blossom in the town itself. Slowly, the community learned to see Malcolm not as an enigma, but as a symbol, a reminder that greatness can hide in plain sight, that legacies can grow in the soil of solitude. One evening, after a long day of visitors and music, James and Lauren stood together in the barn as the last rays of sun poured through the windows. The instruments glowed softly in the light, the photographs shone with a new warmth, and the air carried a faint echo of the songs that had just been played. Lauren whispered that the barn no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like home, not just to them, but to everyone who stepped inside. James nodded, remembering the letter, remembering the weight of the key in his hand that first day. He understood now that they had not unlocked a burden but a gift, one that would continue to unfold long after they were gone. The seasons turned and the farm thrived. The fields yielded crops, the house rang with laughter, and the barn, once a fortress of secrecy, became a beacon of memory. Visitors continued to come, some out of curiosity, others out of devotion, all even touched by the story of a man who had lived quietly among them, guarding a treasure not of gold or silver, but of sound and spirit. James and Lauren found joy in their role, even as the work remained hard, for they knew they were not alone. Malcolm was with them still, in every note that filled the barn, in every child's wide eyes, in every scholar's reverent words. In time, the barn came to symbolize more than Malcolm's life. It became a symbol of the community itself, of its capacity to honor the past and embrace the future. It became a place where strangers gathered and left as friends, where history was not confined to books, but lived in music, in stories, in the creak of wooden floors and the gleam of brass instruments. And in that transformation, James and Lauren discovered their own legacy, forged not by choice but by trust, a legacy they would pass on when their time came. As they closed the doors one night, the stars bright above and the fields whispering with the wind, they felt a profound peace. The barn, once silent and impenetrable, now sang with a voice that would not be silenced again. Its new life was not only the fulfillment of Malcolm's dream, but the beginning of something greater, something that would outlast them all. And in that knowledge, James and Lauren smiled hand in hand, knowing that they had done what he had asked, and more. They had given the barn its voice back, and with it, they had given themselves a place in its everlasting song. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next unbelievable story. Up next, watch the shocking discoveries and hidden secrets in our other videos, each one more surprising than the last. And share this video with your friends and family, because they won't believe what happens until they see it for themselves.